a study where, our work is very much around the development of local and inclusive economies, which we believe define resilience. And of course, resilience is very, very important for your economies in a time of great change, which of course we currently live in. And so one of the things that we wanted to do is we wanted to survey entrepreneurs around the country and ask a whole variety of questions, focused on on what's important for them, what allows them to succeed, and some of the answer and the responses that we got were quite interesting. Some of them were enlightening, some of them were expected, some of them were sad, some of them were hopeful. And so we're gonna we've invited two of our sort of two of our friends, colleagues who we admire and whose opinions are something that we look to and really respect. And so I'd just make a quick introduction to them. Marla and Bill, after I speak a little bit about you, I'd love for you to just spend a couple minutes just introducing yourself after I start you. So we'll start with Marla Blow, who is who's the Senior Vice President of Social Impact for North America for Mastercard. Before Mastercard, Marla was the founder and CEO of FS Card, which was a credit card venture designed to move small dollar loan customers into a more affordable product. And so she definitely comes at this not just from addressing this from Mastercard's perspective, but from being an entrepreneur herself, and a very successful one for years. She's a friend of SecondMuse, and has been instrumental in providing some really great qualitative insights into the study. And so thanks so much for participating in that, Marla. And maybe I'll give you a couple minutes just to allow you to introduce yourself, and then I'll introduce you, Bill.
Yep, happy to. Thank you, Todd. It's a pleasure to be here with everybody, and I look forward to a great conversation. As Todd mentioned, I lead social impact in North America at the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth, where we focus on a lot of the issues around small business and support for entrepreneurship. Our view is that entrepreneurship is the most important path for asset generation, wealth building, addressing the racial wealth gap in this society, and other avenues to supporting the stability of communities, and especially communities on Main Street all across the country. And as mentioned, my own experience here is definitely born out of experiencing every bump and bruise and tripping over things and bumping into things of being an entrepreneur myself, and having learned all of those lessons the hard way, everything from raising capital to building a team, trying to build a stable enterprise, and enabling a business to get off the ground. So I speak on this from the perspective of both supporting entrepreneurship after having been an entrepreneur myself, and with all the bruises and scars to show for the experience. So happy to be here.
Thank you so much, Marla. And our other guest is Bill. Bill Taft is the Senior Vice President of Economic Development at Local Initiative Support Coalition. Some of you may know them as LISC from the great work that they do. Bill leads expansion of LISC's inclusive economic development efforts, specifically, and they have over 30 local programs, and they do it by investing in people, places, as well as businesses. Bill has also been instrumental in helping to shape some of our thinking and in providing really great qualitative insights into the study. Bill, would love it if you gave a couple minutes about you and the work that you're doing at LISC as well.
Yeah, thanks, Todd, for having me. Thanks for the chance to talk with you all this afternoon. I tell you a little bit about LISC first. So LISC is actually a 40-year-old community development support organization that works all over the country, and started out in affordable housing, but now really works in a very holistic way in a wide range of issues, but really is focused on helping our local communities become more equitable places. For the last 3 years, I have led our national effort to expand our work in economic development. So that includes workforce development, place-based revitalization of commercial industrial districts, and also support for entrepreneurs, and particularly entrepreneurs of color. So, and since the advent of COVID and its terrible impact on small businesses across our network of cities, We have really focused on direct support for entrepreneurs. By middle of next year, we will have deployed about $200 million in direct grant making to entrepreneurs, mostly entrepreneurs of color, to help us sustain them through this time period. But we are, at the same time, we're also, through our local offices, building networks that invest in ecosystems that support entrepreneurs locally, and really with a particular focus on this more inclusion of historically not included entrepreneurs in those local markets, in the success of and opportunities of those local entrepreneurial markets. So that's the focus that my team has, and that our local offices are really embedded into this kind of work in each of the community of the 37 places we have offices.
Thank you so much, Bill. It's pretty remarkable the work that you all are doing, and we're going to get into some of the insights that of what you developed. Just a quick reminder that this is being recorded, and we're going to be publishing it afterwards. Also, a reminder that we are, please use the chat function liberally. We're able to sort of take a look. We'll do our best to sort of focus on the conversation and incorporate the comments in the chats sort of accordingly. The format will be, I'll be presenting a couple of some of the insights that have come out of the study, and asking some questions, and we'll have a little bit of a dialogue with both Marla and Bill, and then we'll have some time towards the end to address some questions directly. So feel free to, like I said, put them into the chat box early on, or save them until sort of the end. This study, which again is going to be posted in the chat box, as well as we'll have access for some of you to take a deeper look into the study, was conducted, as mentioned, in partnership with Ipsos, with hundreds of entrepreneurs across the U.S. This was during the COVID-19 pandemic and the movements for racial justice that we've been seeing around the country. And as I mentioned before, while the findings are discouraging in some regards for entrepreneurs, it's one of the things that I think is most hopeful, interesting, exciting about some of the research is that there is a path forward that's suggested by the research that's inclusive. It's less dependent on the billion-dollar booms and busts of Silicon Valley, and more reliant on thousands of business leaders that this study demonstrates are highly invested in their local communities. And so the one of the initial one of the prominent elements that came out through the questions that were asked was this idea that found that entrepreneurs believe that the economy needs to be more inclusive. In fact, this is actually the top concern on entrepreneurs' minds, which is a pretty dramatic element. Remember, entrepreneurs are people who are struggling and fighting for every day to survive in many ways in an unsure economy. And it is in this economy that 60% of entrepreneurs surveyed said that this was their top concern. So there's this kind of notion again that I feel like this suggests to dismantle, which is that entrepreneurs care only about profit. Would love to hear your reaction initially, Marla, and then Bill. Does this statistic make sense to you? Are you surprised by this? What is suggested by this? What does this make you think of?
Yeah, I mean, I think it certainly points to the fact that there is very real awareness of the role that businesses play in society, and that it is not motivated entirely by just here to make as much money as possible, or only for purposes of making money. That organizations recognize their role in being citizens in their communities, being employers, a role that they oftentimes take very seriously. That they recognize that they have long-term relationships with their customers. And I think that's one of the markers that a lot of entrepreneurs and business owners would use as a measure of their own success, is long-term repeat relationships with customers. It's a much easier way to build and sustain a business, right, than going out and having to find customers every single time. And that is all part and parcel of what it means to be in an inclusive arena, right? And thinking about what are the component parts that constitute a stable place. And inclusion is very much one of them. I think that's part of what we are experiencing in the United States, is that some of the major divides are risks to the stability of our society and risks to our democracy, and they are being taken advantage of, I think, in a lot of respects, to create more division. And I heard someone on another conversation talking about a situation abroad, where they mentioned that you can't have a successful business in a failed society, right? And they were talking about a very large issue in another place. But I thought the principle is an incredibly important one, right? And that building stability and building systems and infrastructure and institutions that are trustworthy is a critical component of being successful in running a business, because you count on all of that baseline infrastructure to enable the platform that your business sits on top of. So to me, this is completely rational. It makes all the sense in the world and is very much consistent with the interests of business owners and entrepreneurs, is to have inclusive economies as one of the environmental issues or ambient issues in the world that they operate within.
Yeah, that's a fantastic insight. Oftentimes this idea of social justice is decoupled from, it's this idea of the negative externality. Economies need to grow, but unfortunately, it's going to have, inadvertent consequences around social justice or environmental justice. But there's this idea that actually the two are intricately and intimately related, where you actually cannot have a healthy economy without a healthy society. And so there's this idea that oftentimes, I know that in our programs we talk about this, you cannot decouple inclusion from a good economy. It's not just about being good, or it's about being better and more intelligent. And a healthier economy is by definition a more inclusive one.
Right.
And I think that's a great insight. Bill, would love to hear your reactions.
Yeah, I think it's a reflection of the fact that entrepreneurs, small business owners are very sensitive to the community around them. They're very attuned to their customers, the people that they do business with around them, and just the environment that they're in. So I think that they see the barriers and the injustice that is around them, and then they also, I think a lot of entrepreneurs view themselves a little bit as outsiders anyway. And so, and they also have experienced the challenges of starting or growing a business in an environment that doesn't work well for their business often, whether it's a regulatory issue or a permitting issue or a workforce issue and educational issues. I think that they often feel like they're kind of successful in spite of the environment that they're in. And so I think this idea of empathizing with other entrepreneurs that have even greater barriers put in front of them, whether those are racial or language or whatever those might be, that make that even harder, gives them a level of empathy that, yeah, this is really challenging to start and grow a business, and the system isn't necessarily with us and all the time, and we know it's even harder for others.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. For those of you that have been streaming a little bit late, we're discussing the recent study with Ipsos that SecondMuse commissioned, and are speaking with our partners, Marla Blow from Mastercard, Center for Inclusive Growth, and Bill Taft from LISC. One of the other one of the other elements that kind of came out pretty strikingly around the research study that we did is that entrepreneurs believe that it's harder to be an entrepreneur if you live in certain cities around the United States, and more than half of surveyed entrepreneurs believed that women, Black people, and Hispanics face barriers to entrepreneurship. Would love to hear, I mean, we spoke to this a little bit in the last one, but do you see race and gender as barriers, for entrepreneurs? As well as, what do you building off of that, would love to hear your thoughts about how geography and where your geography is sort of lives over there. Marla, you mentioned some of the battle scars as well, and I'd love, would love you to speak to some of that as well.
Sure, happy to. And a part of my comments on this, every entrepreneur, anybody that's runs a business and has built something, has scars to show for it, right? It is tough. It is tough for everybody. If you've raised capital to do it, it is tough, right? You are trying to convince someone that they ought to write you a 6 or 7 figure check. And, you're like, I promise I'm going to try my best, right? Like, and you're going to get this money back. And ideally you're going to get this money back with some friends, but there's a decent chance, right, that like it might not come back actually. That's a hard sell, right? It is intentionally hard. It's difficult. I mean, think about how hard it is for you to give $5 to somebody, right? Like, let alone somebody asking you for 50,000, 100,000, $2 million, on and on. So it's hard, and it is intended to be hard, right? So I don't pretend like it was supposed to be a cakewalk. And I acknowledge, right, that it's, that one of the best things about meeting entrepreneurs now is I know what questions to ask, and any entrepreneur will sit down and grab a drink and say, like, let me tell you about my experience, right? Because the what looks like a linear up and to the right story of an entrepreneur is never that. Underneath it, there are always massive ups and downs, usually multiple near-death experiences, and probably moderate to severe failure along the way. And I think all of what I just said, all of those things are harder and more true for people in minority groups, for people in parts of the country that receive less investment, right? For the kind of less mainstream parts of our society. One of the things I've been thinking about lately is how narrow the definition is starting to get, right? So once you start rattling it off, we're talking about women, Black people, Hispanic people, LGBTQ, rural. Like, you are now talking, the only thing left is straight white men in New York and San Francisco, right? Like, or something like that. And, I think it points to the fact that there is a real need for change, right? We really need to think about, most importantly, who is making decisions about how capital gets allocated. But I think the numbers are pretty stark, right? When you look at geography, if you take out New York, Boston, and San Francisco, or San Francisco Bay Area, the amount of venture capital, and that's not the only kind of capital, but the amount of venture capital allocated outside of those 3 places is extremely limited, right? I'm in Washington, D.C. I built my business here. It took me actually a long time before I ever pitched to the local shops that would potentially invest in something like this, because the overwhelming amount of the capital is elsewhere. And so, if you're going fishing, you fish where the fish are, and the fish are generally located elsewhere. But I didn't want to move my business. I know a number of entrepreneurs have been asked, told, we'll invest in your company, but you're going to have to move the company to the Bay Area, right? Those kinds of asks, I think, are unfair, right? Those are unfair asks of the capital providers. But I do think that, another example of this is the statistics on the numbers of dollars allocated to women, people of color, the whole list, is appalling, right? Like, and I'll just say appalling as, deliberately, as choose that language, where, let's take 2018 as a year, for example. $140 billion of venture capital money went out the door. Less than 2% of it went to any people of color led businesses over the course of that entire year. And that was considered an improvement, right? Like, and so what we are talking about is massive concentration. And to me, it starts with the check writers themselves being massively concentrated. And so if I were to say, yes, I do think it is harder, though I acknowledge it is always hard. And I do think that rural and anything outside of the capital centers and entrepreneurial centers in the country is an additional barrier, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. And appalling is generous. Generous words to use for the state of, how extraordinarily biased venture capital in particular is, recognizing that it's not the only form of capital. But even, even when you look at just women across the board, it's still 2%. So, and this is particularly highlighted when you get, I mean, there was just another recent $1 billion bust, for yet another technology that was, a poor technology in comparison.
Right. Another thing that I'll add to that, Todd, and I know we'll get Bill in here too, is that women are not a minority group, right? Like that is another way in which it's gotten completely skewed, right? Like women are at least 50% of the population. Yeah. I think actually probably 51% of the population. And so the theory that like the amount of the skew in the distribution, I think, is just sort of highlighted again by that fact, right?
Yeah, 100%. Bill would love to get you in on this.
Yeah, I mean, what we've seen is since the pandemic hit, you look at what allows very small businesses to survive, and it's basically their own capital and friends and family. That's what they're going to have to draw on to make it through this time when they're not able to operate fully, and so their revenues are way down. And what's behind that is when you start looking at the numbers of the capital that's available to entrepreneurs of color, it's very different through either what they have directly or through friends and family. You look at the numbers, our research around Black-owned businesses is that typically white-owned businesses have 7 to 10 times the amount of capital when they start than Black-owned businesses. And that wealth, and you look at also in most metro areas, that's similar to just the difference between net wealth of families that are Black families versus white families. And so there's just not that cushion that gets you through the lean times or the unexpected things, or allows you to launch something new that isn't proven yet. And so that's just a fundamental difference that makes all the difference when things are difficult. And so closing that wealth gap is a critical piece that we all just have to really focus on, and that will have real dividends in the entrepreneurial space. The other thing I would say is that I grew up in a former steel town on Lake Michigan outside of Gary, Indiana, and I'm very sensitive to just the different views of Rust Belt versus coastal views on access to capital and talent and all the other things that make a huge difference in the success of a venture. And one of the things that is interesting about my job is it spans across both coasts and nationally and rurally and rural and urban. And just the way you go about supporting entrepreneurs is very different in those different places. That the level of the fundamentals of support have to be deployed just to accomplish equitable outcomes. But it's in general in many of the places we work that are smaller cities, rural areas where there just isn't good infrastructure to support small business at all. And what's there is really not well coordinated, et cetera. And then, and whereas when you look at how we work in places like New York City, it's a very specific niche that's very specifically focused on entrepreneurs of color within a particular larger framework where there's a lot of really talented, well-resourced organizations working in collaboration. So it's a huge difference.
Yeah, and it raises this other question around this idea of like a healthy economy is necessarily an inclusive economy. And when you're thinking about how you're starving an entire portion, segment of a society of, arguably some of the most creative, risk-taking segment of your population, you gotta imagine the effect it's having on the economy as a whole, the stunting effect that you'll just never know about on the economy as a whole. And
one other thing I just want to add on this, Todd, just to give another example of the ways that organizations can make change here. So LISC, which is led by a very good friend of mine, and so it's exciting to be on this panel with Bill. But I know that LISC actually just made an allocation as a limited partner to a fund in Atlanta called the Fearless Fund. And not yet publicly announced, but already agreed, is that Mastercard is also working on making a grant to the Fearless Fund Foundation to foster entrepreneurial readiness and pitch coaching for entrepreneurs of color who are often unprepared for entrepreneurship because they haven't grown up with the need to, with the experience of pitching or sitting around the table, right? So my son has grown up now having heard me talk about investors all the time, right? I need to find investors. I'm out trying to raise capital. I need to find another investor. So he's at least heard that language, right? But I certainly never heard that language growing up. And so this idea of working from multiple angles, right? As a limited partner in the way LISC does, as a philanthropic entity making grants like we're doing, to enable an organization like the Fearless Fund to be able to serve this community of entrepreneurs is something that I am really excited to see happening in the world, and hopefully is example of how this trend changes, right? And how we create organizations that can change this.
It's great to have you with us, Marla.
Yeah, excited to be part of it.
Yeah, that's a fantastic example, and it's also a reminder of like you don't take centuries of systemic intentional approach to some sort of oppression or another and solve it with just one magic pill. I mean, this is the kind of work that comes from multiple angles simultaneously. It's not about one thing being. It's literally complex problems need to be tackled simultaneously from just about every single angle if we want to make progress in them. And there's an interesting question that Tally Smith posted over there, and just a reminder to encourage all of you who have thoughts, ideas, questions, comments, please post them in the chat. We're paying attention to it. And Tally says, as an entrepreneur, I think a lot about how difficult it is to work without a net in our world. I love how Marla mentions that entrepreneurship is part of how we innovate as a society. And it feels like society just keeps hanging us out to dry. We have to shoulder healthcare and PTO for our employees among all the risks we hold in order to innovate. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really great point. And one of the things that we are working on in the center, which is beyond the grant making, is really joining in on some of the advocacy efforts around changing things like what are the component parts of a sustainable benefit structure in our society? Because the number of people that are not able to access benefits through their work at all is astronomically high. And then who is bearing the cost of that, I think, which is part of the question. Either the cost of having the benefits and having them be provided by the business owner, or not having the benefits and having our society bear the cost in other ways. I think is front and center right now, right? We're living in a pandemic where you face the twin issue of maybe losing your job and then not having health care. And if you contract a virus and now can't go get treatment, you're a danger to the entire society, right? Like that is a structure that is not sustainable. And so figuring out what the solution is going to be and moving it beyond, I think, a lot of the structures that we've become accustomed to, or maybe sort of uncomfortably lived with for a long time, is of paramount importance, right? And I think never been more highly illustrated than where we are today, about being able to get the treatment that you need, about being able to have have the freedom and to be able to take the risk of starting a business and maybe have it not work, but not then live on the other side knowing that if the business doesn't work, then I also lose healthcare and I lose opportunities to save or have benefits associated with saving. Like it's the bar is very high, and I think needlessly so.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, when you look at the cost of the pandemic, I mean, estimates of the cost of the pandemic are ranging anywhere from $3 trillion to $80 trillion when you're pricing in a global depression. When you look at climate change, you're looking at middle of the road cost estimates of trillions of dollars a year in ongoing costs. I mean, would we have ever made the investments that contribute into this problem if we priced in the ultimate cost?
Right.
I mean, it's a question of true cost, and if we would have priced that in, we never would have. It would have been unviable to make that investment sort of on the front side.
Exactly.
Yeah. So there's there's another one of the most striking figures that came out of the study. Was that 89% of entrepreneurs believe that local community level coordination is essential to their success. And this is one of the things that Ipsos told us was that it is it was striking and shocking anytime they get a number which sort of gets into that category. That's something that whenever they see sort of statistically significant figures that get that high, it's something that really screams at them. So 89% of entrepreneurs believe that local community level coordination is essential to their success. Yet nearly half of entrepreneurs believe it is currently hard to secure local resources for their businesses. This is more than twice as difficult for women entrepreneurs as stated not. So not only is it the most important thing, but it is incredibly difficult to achieve, and even more difficult depending on gender. So maybe we'll start with you, Bill. Would love just your reaction to this study, but also a question of how does local support help entrepreneurs? Especially in relation to federal or international support. I mean, this was one of the things that we juxtaposed in this question, was comparing local supports to national, to international. Like, where does your business come from? Where is this important? How's it used? So we'd love to get some of your reactions to that.
Yeah, that didn't surprise me based on what I have experienced dealing with entrepreneurs, is that, their success is really dependent on very local relationships in many cases. And they also see the challenges of dealing with folks that are further remote from them, and the systems that come out of that. And so I think that combination of like their dependence and their trust in local partners and their challenges with bigger systems, sometimes, whether it's healthcare or whatever that might be, make them less positive about the impact of those organizations. So I think the other thing I would say is that that these businesses are nested in a community that's unique, and their challenges and opportunities are going to be a little different than they are in the next community over, and they recognize that as well. And so the response that is going of some kind, either investment or technical support, or whatever that might be, that is going to make them more likely to succeed, is going to be most appropriately crafted and delivered to be successful in connecting to them if that happens locally. And that's really our same philosophy as how we support community development, is we feel like, in particular, if you're working with entrepreneurs of color that are part of communities where there are organizations that they already know and trust and work with, the most effective way to support their success is partnering with those organizations that are already there. And because we have these 37 local offices around the country, they have relationships with those community embedded organizations and that are grassroots and very culturally competent to connect with their particular set of entrepreneurs in that city in the most effective way. So that's that. I love that number because it just reinforces our predisposition.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. It was interesting. Some of we've been operating on faith on a lot of things, and it is great when the numbers back that up. You're like, whew. Marla, would love to hear your reaction to that.
Yeah, I think that's all very well said, and I would encourage everyone to take advantage of those resources. I certainly, again, I'm speaking from my personal experience here, was very late to the game of figuring out what kinds of local support and resources there might be, and including things like branches of your local LISC outlet or local CDFI that might be in your community that could be supportive and helpful. Joining some kind of industry association that might have a local outlet in your area, hugely helpful, right? It just meeting other people that can share with you how they've solved problems. Simple problems from like, hey, don't lease a space in that building over there, right? Because in that building, every time it rains, like there's water, like just normal stuff, right? That comes around with being local in a community and knowing a community well. And then those people can become incredibly important networks for access, for support, for hiring, right? For employment. I have found that to be invaluable. And I didn't really pick up on that thread until, probably 3 years into my own experience of being an entrepreneur. And I so wish I had known some of that earlier. And one of the important things that led to for me was getting plugged into the Washington, to the District of Columbia community public sector team, right? There's economic development in every municipality, local city, in your area. And they are just interested in providing support to entrepreneurs. They want businesses to exist in their communities. And there's opportunities there and support that they can provide that you can't know about unless you happen to be talking to them. And they make, in some cases, they make good efforts to try to make those more widely known. But you're much more likely to find out with them over a roundtable discussion or over a small group lunch or something like that. But getting plugged into those things would have opened up additional avenues much earlier, and I think much more meaningful than any kind of federal level engagement, right? And the other thing I'll add to this is before becoming an entrepreneur, I actually worked in the federal government. I was in a regulatory body here in the District of Columbia as well. And I tell you what, at the federal level, there is no ability to be a scalpel, right? Like there's, at the federal level, everything operates like a broadsword. And so I would sort of on a tongue-in-cheek basis say, if you tell someone, at the federal level, like, hey, I have a hangnail, right? Like what they'll do is come in and lop off your arm and say like, well, hangnail solved, right? Like don't have to worry about that anymore. And so even if you were enjoying that hand, right? Like that, that's a casualty. But that's the scalpel approach. The much more refined, much more thoughtful work can happen at the local level with your local officials that are thinking about your community, that are familiar with the ins and outs, that understand the lay of the land, and can be much more locally effective than anything as far removed as the federal level could be, for example.
Yeah, and I think that what you're also both bringing up is this other element, which is it's really what it was. One of the things that COVID has exposed the fragility of so many economies and so many societies. I mean, the way that it has exposed a magnifying glass on, every crack in the system, in the socio-political economic systems that we've built is pretty striking. In really, across the world. But one of the things that, for example, it is exposed is the fragility of some of the ways that we've built this economy. For example, long, fragile supply chains all of a sudden don't sound like a really good idea when you desperately need masks and they were all sourced from, pretty much one country and you don't have access to them right now. So it challenges a lot of things. But when you ask the question, well, what else could we have? The answer is more likely to come from a bunch of local communities actively innovating in the way what their economies look like, more so than one monolithic system that is going to be much more difficult to innovate around. And I was wondering if I'd love to hear sort of your comments on that. And there was a question that in the chat that I'd love to also have you comment on as well, which is, this is from Jeremy, are there common principles and approaches of local support programs that you have seen leads to more impactful support of entrepreneurs? And maybe what I'll add to that is the development is more innovative and interesting dynamics sort of within the economy of a particular city.
Yeah, I'll start with that one. We recognize the fact, as I said earlier, that there's unique opportunities and challenges in each city, but there are some common principles that we can bring across. One of those is just access to capital is a consistent challenge. And so some things are done better locally and some things are done better at scale. Assembling managing capital is probably done better at scale. So that's one of the unique things about our organization is we also are, we invest about $2 billion a year, and a lot of that is through large loan pools, equity pools, et cetera, that we invest around the country. And so that's one thing we've learned is some of those things are better centralized and much more efficient, and also adds a lot more assurance to our investors that we have a strong balance sheet and we will repay them. And then we're able to disperse that through our channels into these 37 local communities at a very small scale in a very customized way. So our goal is to try to say yes locally, But then at the back end, there's some much more uniform ways of managing risk, et cetera. The other thing I would say is that at the local level, there are already assets to build on. And really the question is, are we using them well? And are we taking risks where we should take risks as a community? Are the risks what they used to be even? And so convening people, and when I say people, I mean, the local small business development center or the Chamber of Commerce or the local unit of economic development agency that is often part of government. Or the nonprofit that was built to like SCORE that supports entrepreneurs locally, getting them in the room, looking at numbers, and actually seeing what's happening in your local economy, particularly with a lens about the inclusion as part of that, is something that we find if you do that regularly, and then talk about, okay, how do we all respond to that and coordinate our response, that then you will actually have a much greater impact with the resources that are already there. And every city has, as Marla said, has an economic development agency. It's just a question of where are those funds going. And there's been there's been a fair amount of research that shows that high percentage of those economic development incentive dollars go to basically highly educated white males that are already making high salaries. And so, we're being really critically focused on where can those resources actually make more of a difference in advancing our broader economy, and entrepreneurship locally is a really critical conversation to have in every community.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I can hardly add much to what Bill said. I think he said that very, very well. The thing and the details of what each economic development entity or is doing in each level, that will vary widely. Some are very focused on enabling local businesses to do business with the locality, right? So to be a supplier or be a seller into the city itself and the city awarding of contracts, et cetera. Others are focused on addressing and maybe distributing dollars that might come from state and local collections of monies that can be used for capital purposes. It's hard to give any generalities around it. Most places will have something very much like that along those lines, though, and it is to all of our benefit that we all avail ourselves of it so that it can stay alive. Because a lot of times, if it goes unused, pretty soon it starts getting looked at as this is not needed, and that money will get reallocated if we're not careful. So I'd say, avail yourself of it and find it in your local community for sure.
Yeah, thanks. Those are great insights. So maybe I'll share one final. There's a lot of gems in the study, but I'll share maybe one final gem to kind of kick us off into the final sort of thing and question answer period. And I see your questions, Jason and Paula, and we'll get to them in the next in this next section. So one of the kind of like moving from the grim, twice as many entrepreneurs see it as corrupt and racist than fair and inclusive, and like there's kind of like assessment of where we're at. There was this kind of sense that COVID presented an opportunity for something different. As a matter of fact, 7 out of 10 of our respondents see COVID-19 and the crisis surrounding the virus as an opportunity to reform the economy. But this raises an enormous question, which is that if we're reforming an economy, what are we reforming it into? And would like to, which again, this is rife with possibilities and enormous, but it begs the question of what do we build that's better than in many places what we've seen crumble. And so would love to hear. Whichever of you wants to go first, how do we rebuild a better, more inclusive economy now?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's the $1 trillion question, right? Or multi-trillion-dollar question. And I certainly think about the opportunities in crisis, right? In crisis moments, there is willingness to try something and willingness to try something new that may not be present in other times. And this certainly feels like one of them. What those specific things are, I think much harder to say. I can talk about some of the characteristics or principles of things that we see present in our structures that we might identify as opportunities to change, right? And I think one of the ones I would characterize as basically kind of an economic inefficiency, right, is bias, right? And the way that we all learn, about efficient markets, and economists are always kind of assuming away, other kinds of inefficiencies, and assuming perfect information and market efficiency, then the following things will be true. And I think what we are dealing with is when those economic models actually turn out not to apply, that you actually have to make some kind of accommodation for the fact that these inefficiencies do exist, right? And that bias does exist, and that those things form a drag on society, and that markets do not function efficiently because of a host of things, including bias as one of those. And so being forced to actually grapple with that and reckon and maybe adjust some of the models that are being used at the highest levels in the thinking of our leading economists is an opportunity to get them to help propose some other models that may incorporate and contemplate the fact that we have to allow for inefficiencies, that human inefficiency continues to creep in, right? And it turns out to be something that you cannot explain away or assume away. And then that allows for a much more convenient economic model. And so I think if you look at what we're hearing from the Federal Reserve, for example, right, where they have made an announcement that they are going to start to address racial equity in the way that they think about the U.S. economy, that's huge, right? That is a monumental shift at the highest level of this society, about how we approach markets, about how we govern markets, about what kinds of decisions get made in leading our market sector. And so those are things that I think are really promising and really interesting opportunities to help change what outcomes we experience, right? And help change things like the massive concentration of wealth, the continued and persistent vulnerability of some parts of our society, and that there is no safety net in a lot of those cases. And what does that mean, right? So very hopeful about that. And I think it was, I think it was Winston Churchill. I can't remember if it was Winston Churchill or somebody like that said, never let a good crisis go to waste. And I think, then maybe Rahm Emanuel brought it back to the fore during the Obama administration. But taking advantage of moments of crisis to enable some reframing or force the inclusion of other perspectives is a really important opportunity.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And we actually often find that when we're developing economies, we love to come in when it's just being formed, or it's a new technology or a new sector for an old city, because we find that in the development process, you can tremendously influence both the culture and the composition of an economy, just because it's an influenceable moment. But yeah, would love to hear your thoughts, Bill, before we get to some questions.
Yeah, my boss, Maurice Jones, likes to say the inequities in our economy were often intentional, and it's going to take intention to reverse them. And so we have to very explicitly focus on how we're going to reverse those, and not just assume they will automatically change. So I think that's just to reinforce what Marla said. But the other piece I would say is that the one encouraging thing as far as this moment goes is that we have seen an awakening of, I would say, the corporate community, but also the philanthropic community and maybe the general public, to how important the small businesses in their communities are to their communities and how fragile they are. And that it is going to take intention to support them. So, ultimately, a year ago, there was really not a level of corporate support for small businesses. And now it's over $100 million that we've raised just in the last few months from, in many cases, major corporations that who in the past would have been viewed as sort of pitted against the small entrepreneur, and have realized we need them. Our communities where we have businesses, where we have locations of our corporation, need these small businesses to be successful, for those communities to be good places for us to do business. And so I think that realization not going to go away next year. I think it's as long as we do a good job of following up on that, and continue to engage the broader community into really learning about the importance of entrepreneurship to the vitality of those communities and to the future of employment, and keeping, hanging on to their most talented people in their community, all the things, just the quality of life that everybody experiences, as well as certainly the benefit to those entrepreneurs and their own families, all critical to the vitality of everybody. And I think that's much more apparent now.
Yeah, no.
I think that's really well said. And I just want to add on top of that one other thing, right? And to bring Mastercard into the conversation for a second here, right? Mastercard's a giant company. It's in the payment space. No one would ever say that Mastercard is in the restaurant business, for example. But you know what? When people don't go to restaurants, Mastercard is acutely aware of that fact, right? And the relationship between big business and small business is a really important one. I think Bill said that very well, and it's worth adding that punctuation mark to it, right? That big business does not exist in a vacuum, right? And it is oftentimes about serving, in some cases, like Mastercard does, small business all over the country. And so the interest of the big business community, Fortune 200 company like Mastercard, is very much in keeping the small business community alive, right? I mean, tell it to Square, right? Or Salesforce or anybody else. The small business community is their customer base, and so even if it's just self-interest, right, that alone is reason enough to ensure that this group survives. But I think that Bill's point is a really powerful one.
Yeah, no, I mean, and again, this is kind of like this dismantling of kind of like false dichotomies. It's not about one or the other.
Right.
A healthy economy doesn't need this. So we have a couple questions that have kind of come in. We also have 6 minutes before we sort of had the wrap up time. So let me start with a question from Jason Teeters. Question for both of you. What is an intentional approach to breaking down silos in small communities? It often feels like ecosystem building, which he defines as players plus conditions for entrepreneurs, often sit in a silo. And we rarely see communities invest in the unsexy business of relationship building, which is a much needed first step.
Yep. So, I've had a couple of conversations about ecosystem building, and there are some really interesting theories floating around out there. One of them, I think, is implied or maybe even directly stated in the question that Jason is asking here, and that is that you need some kind of a trusted party that can bring people to the table and get people together. So in some instances, that might be a philanthropic actor. It might be a prominent individual in a community. But that person is needed to kind of set the table, right? And bring the business community, bring the investor community, bring local educational institutions, bring the budding entrepreneurs to the table. Bringing people together who are looking to support and create business opportunities, and enable a dialogue, right? Enable network building and enable exchange of ideas. And when that piece is absent, even if you have the other components, you are still left with that silo issue. And so I think one of the things I'd encourage is to think about who is a trusted and relatively impartial actor in the local community that may be able to play that role. Because it's actually a really important one that is easily overlooked. I think that's a very astute question.
Yeah, coming from an organization that started out of community organizing way back in the 60s, I would say that since we have a foot in the economic development and finance world, another one in the community-based world, we definitely, this challenge is one that is the age-old challenge of community development, and that is convening people who don't usually talk to each other and finding common ground and moving forward and figuring out a way to keep them moving together on those common areas of interest. And it is a body of work that takes expertise and takes credibility in the community. And so that is exactly what each of our local offices try to serve that role in their communities. And they have other partners that do the same, and empowering them is part of our role too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there's one final short question that was directed to you, Marla, is what do you see as the most effective ways that large corporations can best support and engage with entrepreneurs, and in particular, women and minority-led startups?
Yeah, so one of the things that lots of ideas about this, but one I'll highlight is to look at and simplify process. You're a large corporation, you end up with processes that are out of this world, right? Many of us have probably bumped into them. If you were trying to figure out how to do business with, with Mastercard, I'll use Mastercard as example number one. Going through the hoops, getting yourself getting yourself approved, getting through diligence, in order to even get the first round of business underway is incredibly demanding exercise, and that is daunting, right? Like it's a deterrent to getting people to work with small business. But I think those kinds of customer relationships and those kind of commercial relationships can be the credibility building and the business building opportunity that a small business can change the game for those entities. But making that simpler, making that point of entry much more obvious and less reliant on, I happen to be in the country club with the guy that knows someone in purchasing at a big company in my local area. That's not a path, right, to enabling others to get their way through, and then needing somebody to shepherd you through that process. That's a barrier, right? So figuring out, looking at your process, importantly in the supplier world. And one last point on that. People think supplier means like automotive and factories and who's buying windshield glass and stuff like that. That's not what I mean. I'm talking about you buy professional services, lawyers, accountants, investment banking, consulting, technology, the corporate spend, corporate expenditure. I shouldn't even call it supplier. Corporate expenditure is the biggest opportunity, but it needs to be made simpler.
That's fantastic. Marla, Bill, thank you so much. We love you both, and not small reason is how brilliant your insights are and how much care you put into the work that you do. One thing is for sure is that if we're going to be building something for the future that's better than the past, is that we have to have a lot more of these conversations and think with each other at a somewhat unprecedented way. Thank you all for joining as well. We just dropped a link in the chat to take a look at the full study. And again, thank you so much for joining. It's been a joy to spend the last hour with you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Todd. Thanks, Bill. Good to meet you.
It's good to meet you.